Bienvenidos, Ushamdi, and welcome. CMIT 454, sections 6380 and 6382 for the first 8-week term in the spring 2018 semester at the University of Maryland University College. This is the Cisco Networking Academy CCNA Security version 2.0 course, and this morning's Packet Tracer tutorial and solution set is going to be on Packet Tracer activity 3.6.1.2. And this is going to be our first look at configuring AAA, right? And we'll talk about Cisco's ACS appliance and the ICE appliance, and we'll talk about some differences between basically ACS and ICE, as well as TACACS and RADIUS. So let's go ahead and dive into this activity. So here is the topology that we are going to be presented with, and let's take a look at our objectives. We've got our addressing table over here to the right, and the objectives, we're going to configure a local user account. We're going to talk a lot about this, right? Because again, remember, I can't drive this point home enough. Packet Tracer is a scaled down version of Cisco IOS, so it's not going to offer us all of the bells and whistles that we would typically see on a real Cisco router or switch. And so I'm going to highlight those areas because it's very important to understand we're doing certain things in Packet Tracer which may or may not be considered best practice. We're going to verify some information. We're going to use TACACS, plus we're going to use RADIUS, and I'm just checking to see here. We've got some password information, admin1, admin PA55, so we've got to keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and dive in here with part one. We're going to go ahead and configure local AAA authentication. Now remember, that command that we're going to see, which is that AAA new model command, remember that basically right now we're simply using the old model, but we don't have to say anything to enable it. And what it is it's that authentication, authorization, and accounting, right? And remember those 3 A's: authentication, authorization, and accounting. And we use what we call the local AAA database, which is simply just the running config. It's really nothing more than that, right? We go in and we create a username, and we do it right in the running config, and we save it. That is the local AAA database, and it's also considered sort of the AAA old model, if you will. Now, again, there's no command AAA old model. But from a differentiation standpoint, we want to differentiate that from the AAA new model, right? And the new model is going to add in some additional configuration work that we need to be aware of. So let's test our connectivity. So ping from PCA, and let's get PCA up here, and we're going to ping over to PCB. And so let's get the command prompt up, and first let's get PCB's IP address here. So we're going to ping 192.168.2.3. So can I ping from PCA to PCB? There's probably a timeout here once or twice before we get some success. Yeah, I got to ARP out, right? That address resolution protocol to get my default gateway all dialed in there. And now we have connectivity. I'm pausing here. I'm just looking over. Do they want us to do? Let's test to see if we can get to C. .3.3. And again, right, the local PC is going to say, hey, I have no idea how to get to that destination. It's going to use its default gateway. And we've got connectivity between A and B and A and C. Now let's try B and C. And then this is going to wrap it up here. So we're going to ping 192.168.3.3. And that's PCC. So we've got connectivity all throughout our environment here. Now, the first thing we're going to do, step 2 here, configure a local username on R1. And this is going to require some additional conversation. And the username is just going to be admin1. Now, you'll notice we've got a capital A in here. And when we get into the AAA new model, you're going to find out that we can actually make it a case-sensitive operation when we create usernames, when someone goes to log in. All right, so let's pull router 1 up here and give ourselves some additional space with which to work. And we'll pull this down just a skosh. And to the CLI we go, right? So here we are in user exec mode. We're going to use the enable command to transition into privilege exec. And the password, is it Cisco? I'm going to guess here, Cisco ENPA55. Yeah, that's typically what it is. All right. So Cisco ENPA55, and what are we doing again? We're going to configure a username. So I'm going to say username, I'm going to do a question mark, and here's where we simply put in the name of the user. And what I'm modifying right now is the local AAA database, right? This is the local AAA database. Now, I can say password if we were going to do a type 7 password. I could say secret if we were going to do type 5. Or I could assign a privilege level. Right now, very important to know the defaults with Cisco. So the default is not 0, and that's a common misconception, is that if I were to create a username, and let me step over here real briefly to a real Cisco router here. We'll go on the router we did the OSPF work on. If I was to go into global config with configure terminal and say username Travis and password ABC123, right? And if I was to log in as the user Travis, and so let's do that. So we'll say linecon 0, login local, and then let me exit out here. And so I hit enter, and it says username, so we say Travis, and then my password was ABC123. So now I am the user Travis. So now it's very easy to check. I say show privilege, right? Show privilege. And the current privilege level is 1. So definitely know that when you're creating user accounts, the privilege level by default is 1. And you should never assign 15 to a user account, right? They should have to come in, and typically what I do is I'll do privilege level 0. And then they need to know the enable password in order to transition from user exec mode into privilege exec mode. Okay, so we could say user admin 1, and our requirement is with a secret password. Okay, so we know we're going to be using MD5 here of admin 1 PA55. All right, so that is our local AAA database user, admin 1, and if I come down here, you can see right there, admin 1. Now, remember I mentioned the case-sensitive thing. If I transition back here and I log out, and I go to log in again, and it says username, and I say Travis, and then ABC123. Was that case sensitive on the check? So the answer is no, right? So remember, by default, if I go to log in as Travis, and in the local AAA database, it's all lowercase, I could literally do something like this. Cisco, I'm sorry, not Cisco, ABC123. And that's going to get me logged in. And so that should prove to you that it is not a case-sensitive operation by default. By default, not a case-sensitive operation. Okay, so the password is case-sensitive, but the username is not. All right, so we've got step 2 taken care of. Step 3, configure local AAA authentication for console access and use the local database. Okay, so here is where we are now going to transition away from the old local AAA database model. We're now going to go to the AAA new model, where we can still leverage the local AAA database, but we're going to be doing it in a new fashion. Now, there's a very important reason that they had us configure the user account first. And again, be very wary of this. If I was to log onto the router and say AAA new model and hit enter, and I was to do any kind of configuration here, right, by default, we're going to have some things that are going to happen. I could get myself locked out of the router very easily if I don't have that sort of backup admin account right here. So make sure that the first thing that you do is you always create some sort of a global account that is like a safeguard so that you're going to be able to get back into the router. So I say AAA new model, and then we're going to say AAA, and let me read the next step, authentication method, enter AAA. Okay, so just a default method list. So the method list, and let's talk about that. So I'm going to say AAA authentication. So I'm using the local AAA database, and we're going to put that at the very, very end here in a second. But when I say AAA authentication, you can see, what is it for? Well, you can use AAA for PPP even, right? For the point-to-point protocol. We could use it for the enable password, but we want to use it just for getting logged in. Now, I can give it some, fancy name, or we can simply just go with default, right? And the default can then be applied to whatever lines I would like. So I could apply it to the VTY, those virtual terminal lines. I could apply it to the auxiliary lines. I could apply it to the console lines. Or, like I said, you could create a custom name. So I could come in here and say console. That way, when I look, I know that, oh yeah, this is the one that was created for the console. But here they're just asking for the default, right? So AAA authentication, login default, and now we get to our method list, right? So what's the word I'm looking for? I guess method is the best word. So what methods would you like to attempt to perform the authentication with? Now you'll see I've got the group over there, right? So I could say group radius or TACACS. I could say local, right? And I can have multiple methods in order to authenticate me, right? So, typically this is what you see. Now, we're being asked to do, local. So I would simply say local and hit enter. Now, let's digress here for a second and come over to router 1, where if I go into global config and I say AAA new model, and again, that command is mandatory to see any of the other AAA options that are going to be available to you. So AAA new model, AAA authentication, authentication for my login, and here's where we could use a name. So if I wanted to have a special authentication list that I'm going to be using here for the console lines, I could just say console, or you could simply say con, right? And take a look. I've got a lot of different choices here. So you can see we still see the group, we still see enable, we still see local, but very important is here's this local case. And that means that the user names will now be treated as case sensitive. So if I was to then say local-case, and then if I wanted to say, okay, well, after it uses the local AAA database, use the TACACS servers that we have defined, and then after that, use the RADIUS servers. And if none of those three work, and they're in order, they're going to happen in order from left to right. If none of those work, then I'm simply not going to be able to get logged in. And so this is where it becomes very important that if you're using TACACS, and again, it's going to depend on your local security posture. Some places may say, hey, if you can't get logged in with TACACS or RADIUS, then you're not getting logged in, right? And it may force that. But typically, you'll see a local account of some kind. And again, I could even put, local at the very, and actually, is it going to take that? I think we've got local case. Yeah, it's not going to let me do local again. So we've got local case sensitive, right? So you want some sort of a failback, a fail safe, so that if you can't get logged in with the TACACS servers, maybe they're not reachable, and the RADIUS servers aren't reachable for whatever reason, that you can still get logged in locally. So now I'm going to hit enter. And so how would I apply this? Well, I would go back to the console line con 0, and I would say, and let's do a question mark here, and you can see that we've got, where are we at here? And I'm trying to remember, oh, it's login I'm looking for, sorry, login, question mark. Yeah, login authentication. And here's where I could put, again, if it was the default, if we were just using the default and we didn't create it with our own name, I would just say default. But now we've created it called con, right? And so now that's going to apply that login. And so if I was to say do show run, and we'll begin at con, it's going to put us way at the top. Let's begin at VTY. Oops, sorry, VTY. There we go. Oh, and that's under the console lines. Okay, so we're just going to do this. I'm going to say do show run, and probably could have done begin line, or maybe section line con 0, but we'll bring it all the way down to the bottom here. And so you can see the login, right? Authentication con. And what this means is it's now going to refer back to where we have that AAA statement, right? AAA authentication to get logged in on the console lines, and that's a custom name. I could have made it anything I wanted. First, we're going to attempt the local AAA database, keeping in mind it's going to be case sensitive. Then we're going to look at the group of TACACS servers that are defined. It could be one or more. And then the group of RADIUS servers that are defined. It could be one or more. So now let's rerun this exercise that we've been doing here on router 2, where I come to get logged in. It says username, and I'm going to say TRAVIS. And we know that worked earlier, right? And I hit enter, and you can see can't process authentication, right? We can't get logged in, and it didn't work at all. What if I say Travis lowercase? Ah, now we get the password. So you can see that that local case does work, and not a bad idea, although typically you don't see usernames in mixed or camel case or all uppercase. Typically they're in all lowercase, but it still can't hurt to give yourselves a little additional security there. And then the password was ABC123. And you can see it's going to take a second here. At least I think it was ABC123. Travis ABC123. There we go. Travis ABC123. So, and we're in, right? So keep that in mind. But this is all we needed to do here was AAA authentication, login, default, local. And that is the method list, right? And the name of that, or I should say basically the name of the method list is, or better way to say this would be, default is the name that we're using to identify this method list, or this list of methods that are going to be used to authenticate us to log in. And that's how we're going to refer to it as just default. Okay, on to step number, I think we're going to go to the console line here, configure the console line. So we're going to do what we just did actually. So we're going to say line con 0, and I'm going to say login, authentication, and if I do a question mark, you can see, are we going to use the default, or are we going to put in our custom defined name for however we custom defined it. So I just say login authentication default. All right, and that takes care of step number 4. Now we're on to step number 5, verify the AAA authentication method. Well, how can we do this? It says verify the user exec login using the local database. So let's go ahead and say in. I'm going to save my config here, right, just in case this guy gets reloaded for whatever reason. We'll say write memory, and I'll exit out. When I hit enter, it wants my username. Now, remember, we didn't say case, there was no local case option here. So, but I'm going to stick with, I'll do this, and let's see if packet tracer functions like the normal iOS. So admin 1, and I am now forgetting it's admin 1 PA. So ADMIN 1 PA 55. All right, so packet tracer didn't like the mixed case, although it should not have been an issue. This is like a packet tracer thing. So ADMIN 1 PA 55. All right, and so we are now logged in, and the enable password is Cisco ENPA 55. All right, so now we're back in. So that takes care of part 1, and we validated that we could get logged back in. Again, remember, by default, packet tracer is going to pretend as if it was case sensitive. It is not. On real Cisco iOS software, it is not a case sensitive operation for the username. Let me make sure I'm clear on that. The username, the password will always be case sensitive. Now, configure local AAA authentication for the VTY lines. And so here's where we may actually create a custom one. I'm kind of scanning ahead to see if that's what they have us do. All right, so configure domain name and crypto key for use with SSH. Now remember, we do not have to use the domain name in order to generate the SSH keys. Chances are you're going to, but it's not required. Remember, we can label the keys, and that key, it's just simply going to be the name of the key that's going to be used. So let's get into global config here, and let's say IP domain name and CCNA Security.com. All right, so we've got the domain name configured, and create an RSA crypto key using 1024 bits. So crypto key generate RSA, and remember, in packet tracer, we have to hit enter here, and it's going to ask us to type in the size of the key, 1024 bits. Right, and we're going to get some points for that probably, maybe. But again, remember, if I come over here, And let's see, I think router 9, is there any config? Yeah, there's config on here, but I don't think there's any keys. So if I was to say show crypto key, my pub key, and I think that's all I need, all. You can see there's no keys here, right? So if I go into global config and I say, and actually let's say do show run and include domain. So is my domain name set on this router? It is not. So if I say crypto key generate, whoops, some spelling challenges here, generate, and actually before we get to RSA, or actually RSA, I can label, simply provide a label, because that is the use of the domain name. It's being used to identify this key. It's going to be used as in the name of the key. So crypto key generate RSA label, and I'll just say Trav's key. And then I can put the modulus, and we'll do 1024. Now remember that 1024 is critical, and the reason that we do 1024 is, remember, to do SSH version 2, our key needs to be 768 or greater. So now when I say do show crypto key, do show crypto key, my pub key, no context sensitive help here, all is what I think we had, yeah. So take a look now, it's the key name, right? So this is the name, the domain name would show up here, and I believe when you put the domain name in, it's going to prepend the router name as well. And I think we just did this the other day. I can't remember which router we were on. Let's see if it was this guy here. And we say show crypto key, my pub key, all. No. So, but anyway, remember, you don't have to have the domain name. You can do a label, and a label will substitute just fine for that domain name. And so here we go. We've got our keys created here. And what is my next step? So configure a named list, right? So now we're no longer using the default list. We're going to create a custom named list. So AAA authentication, and the name list is going to be login SSH dash login SSH login. And so now here we go. And this is where we define. So this is the method name, the name of the list, right? And now we define the methods, right? And so the method list will be the list of methods that we can use to authenticate a user via AAA. So again, here it's very straightforward. It's just going to be local. But remember, I could have said group TACACS, group RADIUS, and then local. And if I can't get to TACACS and then I can't get to RADIUS, it's going to fall back to the third and final, which is local, and then I should be able to get in using that admin one account that we've created. All right, so we've got that in there. The next step is going to be to apply this guy, and here's where we're at. Configure the VTY line, step 3, to use the name AAA method and only allow SSH. And this is key, this and right here, and you'll learn as you go on and you do a lot of the Cisco activities, that sometimes the English is what you're trying to decipher. Not really the technical aspect, but what is it that they're asking you to do? And remember, this and is a conjunction, meaning configure the VTY lines to use the named AAA method, stop, and then you also need to make sure that only SSH is allowed for remote access. So it's not simply applying the AAA or the login authentication named method list here. We're going to be doing a transport input command. We're going to be limiting the protocols that are allowed to connect to the router. So let's get into line VTY 0 to 15. And again, we would simply say login and authentication, and then the name is SSH, and what was it? Dash login, dash login. So we say login authentication, SSH, dash login, and boy oh boy, went from 21% to 43%. So that was quite important right there. Now, that's the first part of the sentence. The second part of the sentence is only allow SSH for remote access. Well, it's not talking about an ACL here, because they're not asking you to create an ACL. So what they're looking for is the transport input, right? SSH. Now, I can say input and output, right? So I could even say transport output SSH. And so what I've just done is I've limited the methods or the protocols that can be used for inbound connectivity to the router, right? Not transit traffic, not traffic that's passing through it, but this is for traffic destined to this node, as well as traffic that is going to be generated from the node. So this is what we're calling that management plane, right? So if I wanted to connect from this router to another router, I can only use SSH, right? And if another router is trying to connect to this router, it can only connect to these VTY lines via SSH. And this is, again, those are definitely best practices. So now let's go ahead and verify the SSH configuration. So we're going to SSH from the command prompt of PCA. All right, well, let's first do this. Let's go ahead and say write mem. And let's pull up PCA here. Whoops, we'll pull PCA up here and drag this a little bit to the right. So we're going to say SSH -L. We'll put our username in here, admin1. And you know what I just realized? I don't know the IP address that we're trying to connect to. So we use 192.168.1.1. So 192.168.1.1. And you can see it opened it. What's my password? It is Cisco. Oh, you know what? Was it ENPA55? That's not right. It was admin1 PA55. There we go. And as you can see, I am now on router 1. Now, SSH uses TCP. So the command's probably not here. This is a great command. Oh my goodness. Okay, fantastic, man. Packet Tracer pulls through. So this command right here is one of my all-time favorites. Show TCP brief. Because it's going to show me any TCP-based sessions that this router has established. Now, it's not going to show all the TCP sessions running through the routers, right? Or through this router. This is for management plane traffic, right? And if it was BGP, right, if we were using the BGP routing protocol, we would see that we had a connection on port 179 if we had a peering with another router. So, but this gives us great visibility into, hey, somebody is SSH'd into this router right now. And if you're on the console port and no one is supposed to be on this router, and let's say maybe this address is from over in Europe somewhere, you should probably be concerned, right? So, but show TCP brief, fantastic command to use in this scenario. So now we've confirmed that connectivity, so that looks good. And now we are on to part 3 here. So configure server-based AAA, because what have we done so far? All we've done right here to this point is configure local AAA database authentication methods, right? And we've got our method list, and the list really isn't too comprehensive, right? It's simply using the local AAA database. But this is the big advantage of using RADIUS and TACACS. And I've had this happen before where I've come into a shop where we had 300 plus Cisco routers and switches. And they said, okay, you know, here's the global user account, right, which was admin. Here's the password. The privilege level's 15. You need to create yourself an account on all these devices. And so literally, I had to manually go to 300 devices and create an account. And one of the first questions I asked is, why are we not using RADIUS or TACACS, some sort of centralized authentication approach? And so this is the advantage. If you only have a single router, then it doesn't make much sense to set up a RADIUS or TACACS server, right? But if you've got maybe 5, 10, 20, 100, right, this could save you a ton of time. It's going to allow us to centralize all of the authentication queries, right, and configuration. Because I would literally configure the user on this AAA on the RADIUS or TACACS server one time. And then all of the devices, they just simply point to that server to do the authentication component. So let's make this happen here. So for backup, and were we supposed to do that? It's only router 1 that we're working with here, right? Okay, so now we're going to do TACACS on router 2. So configure a backup local database entry, right? And this is extremely important. Before you say AAA new model, you immediately want to make sure that you've got a backup account that you can use to get onto the device. So it's going to be Cisco ENPA55 for the privilege exec password. And so here we go. We're going to go into global config, and this is going to be admin2. I'm sorry, admin2. I just look at the username. Username, admin2, and a secret password of admin2 PA55. Now, you'll notice in both cases they've had us use secret. And this is you want to avoid this because this is going to give me what? What type password am I going to have? Whoops. And I think I just went right by the username statement. What kind of password is this? Username admin secret 5. That is an MD5 hash password, and you can see the hash is right there. Now, remember, Packet Tracer doesn't support all the functionality, but the best practice would be, and I'll say username admin 3, and if I did a question mark, what we would see on a real Cisco router is algorithm type. So let's see what that would look like. And this is what you want to do as a best practice. So again, we're going to say username admin2, and when I do the question mark, there it is, algorithm type. And that's the option that we want here on our command line. And we've got 3 choices. And I wish it was in a different order here. They do it alphabetically. Whoops, sorry, they do it alphabetically. But think of it like this. MD5 is the worst, needs to be avoided. Again, if we were to go back to that next generation encryption NGE PDF that Cisco publishes, that is to be avoided. Then we have SHA-256 as the next best. But the very best is SCRYPT. And one of the reasons that SCRYPT is better than the other 2 is that when you're experiencing a brute force attack, in other words, somebody's got some sort of a dictionary attack and they're doing a brute force trying to crack the password, that the cost from a CPU and resource perspective becomes exponentially more expensive every iteration. So what do I mean by that? So when you're using SCRYPT as the hashing algorithm here, I was just about to say encryption algorithm. When you're using SCRYPT as the hashing algorithm, every time a brute force attack cycles through another iteration, SCRYPT makes it more and more expensive from a CPU and resource perspective than any of the other 2, which is why the choice should always be type 9, which is going to be this SCRYPT here. So I would say SCRYPT, and once I do that, I have to say secret, and then I put in my secret. I'll say ABC123, right? Nothing fancy here. So, but take a look at this. Do show run section, oops, sorry, not section, include username. Now let me ask you this, just looking at that, again, I know we've seen this before, but I've got to drive this point home because a lot of people look past this. This is significantly more complex and better than, take a look at the type 7. Even if I were to say username, oops, sorry, username, we'll do admin, I'll say admin 5 for type 5. Admin 5, algorithm type, and I could say MD5 and then secret ABC123. So we're we're hashing the same password, and look at the difference, right? Look at the difference. Very significantly different. And so for type 8, I'll say admin 8, and we'll say algorithm type, I'll do SHA-256. And then let's take a look at these guys again, right? And so you can see the SHA, at least with a password as simple as ABC123, SHA, which is type 8, is relatively as complex. But again, the real advantage of SCRYPT is making those brute force attack attempts more expensive through each iteration. So type 9 SCRYPT, that is what you should be using for your user accounts. However, here, Packet Tracer doesn't yet support that, so we're going to go ahead and stick with username, and actually I just did that to show you that algorithm type wasn't a choice. Okay, so we've created our backup user account. Let's make sure that it's in there, and there it is, admin2 with the admin2 PA55. So click on the TACACS server, right? Now this is something that unfortunately I don't have in my lab environment, maybe one day. So we're going to click on the TACACS server. Let's scoot it over here a little bit. And it's asking us to go to the Services tab because this is where AAA is going to be located. There's AAA. Notice there is a network configuration entry for router 2. And there it is right there. Right? So the client name, the client IP, the server type, right? Are we a TACACS or RADIUS, or we're a TACACS server? And what is the key? TACACS PA55. So let's make sure we got the user setup entry. Configure the TACACS specific server specifics on router 2. Okay, so here's where we're now going to get into. Says this is the information that we need in order to use the TACACS server to authenticate router 2's authentication attempt. So we'll come to router 2, and now we're going to set router 2 up to use the TACACS server. So the first thing that we're going to do, and let's see what they have up there. Yeah, so they actually give us the commands here. Now, a little additional information here on these commands, and this is going to be very, very important, is that with the newer iOS software, some of these, the syntax has changed a little bit. So let's go ahead and we'll follow along here. So what's the first thing that we need to do here? We're going to create the TACACS server entry, and we're going to say host 192.168.2.2. So we're basically saying, hey, this is the TACACS server, and we only have a single server. If we had more than one server, what would we do? Would I put in another entry, right? So we're going to get some points for that. But what if it was 2.3 as well? What happens now? Does it keep both of those entries, or is it the last one that I entered in? No, it keeps them both, right? Even though the second one is bogus, and we'll pull that out right now. And we'll pull that out right now by saying no TACACS server host 192.168.2.3, just to show you, right, that it's going to keep those multiple server entries in. But what you can do with the newer iOS is you can actually create groups. And the syntax is even different, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The syntax is even more different with this TACACS server command right here. So here's where I say TACACS server key, let me make sure I spell this right, TACACS PA55. All right, we should get a couple points to getting the password in there. No, did I spell that right? TACACS PA55. Yes, that's correct, but it doesn't look like we got any points, but that's okay. So I've got my TACACS server defined, and I've got my key defined. Now, on the newer versions of iOS, and if I'm not mistaken, this is the latest and greatest 15, sorry, do show version. This is the latest and greatest 15.7 code here, right? So this is very, very recent code. So when I say TACACS, you'll see it says TACACS-server. If I do a question mark, we've got all kinds of commands. Now, where is the host option? You'll notice that the host option isn't here. And this is very important, because what used to happen is you would get a warning telling you that the old way of configuring TACACS and RADIUS was going to be deprecated soon. I'm here to tell you that with 15.7 and beyond, it's deprecated. It's not going to be there. So when I type TACACS, what if I say question mark here, right? Or I do a question mark right after TACACS. You can see that the only option available to me is that TACACS-server. But what if I say TACACS space server? No, nothing, right? So the question becomes, how do you get the TACACS server in here? Because I couldn't say host, right? And there is no simple command that's just TACACS. So if I was to, if I was to say TACACS-server and do a question mark, we take a look here, there's really no way for us to get that information in here. And so 15.7 operates a little differently than, let's say, if I come down here to router 9, right? And I'm going to come full circle here in a second. We go into global config. If I say TACACS server question mark, the host option is here. And so router 9 is not running one of the latest and greatest codes. It's running 15.1. So what about router 1, which is 15.3 code? Again, having an understanding, having an understanding of the different versions, TACACS server, right? You see the host option is there. Now, if I back up a little bit and I do a question mark here, it's only TACACS server. If I come over to router 9 and I say, oops, sorry, I don't want TACACS server all the way. I do a TACACS question mark. You can see it's only TACACS server. But these previous versions of iOS, 15.3 and 15.1, do have the host option, whereas the latest and greatest on 15.7 does not. So I'm going to move over here to this one because and actually, what did we use here, Travis? I say ABC123. Okay. Right. So if I go into global config here and I say TACACS, or TACACS, make sure I spell it right. So 15.7 code is a little quirky, right? And that's not a mainline release. Here you can see with 15.6, I've got TACACS and TACACS server, right? So it would appear that there's two different ways to set this up. But when I say TACACS server question mark, again, there is no host option. No host option here, right? So let me come back. And I'm going to explain why we're seeing the differences between these latest and greatest versions. So if I say do show run, and I include AAA, or just AA, which should have been AAA, you can see I've typed in AAA new model on this router. On 15.7, have I typed that in? Do show run, include AAA. No. In fact, there is no AAA new model. So this is a very, very important distinction here. On the newer iOS code, what's going to happen when you say, come on to 13, once you enter in the AAA new model, then you will be given access to just the TACACS, right? Because without access to the TACACS command by itself, now I'm not talking about TACACS-server, simply TACACS, so that I can get the host in there, right? You're not going to see that option because, again, here I say TACACS, it only goes to TACACS server. I come back, I do a question mark, there is no TACACS. But what happens if I do this? AAA, new model. And then I say TACACS, question mark. Now it's there. And this is, under the newer iOS versions, this is how you get the host in there. Because you can see, TACACS server, there is no option for host. And this is 15.7. TACACS server, there is no option. And actually, it's because this one's already been enabled. There is no option for host. So the only way with the newer iOS to get that host information in there is to say TACACS server and then put the name of the server. So I could say, let's just keep it easy, TAC1 for TACACS server 1. And now it drops me into a sub-configuration mode where I have to put in the address, right? And I have to say, is it an IPv4 or an IPv6 address? So I would say address IPv4, and let's just say 192.168.1.1. Now if I say do show run, section TACACS, there is my TACACS server, or the first server, because now I could create another one. I could say TACACS server TAC2. And again, address IPv, and we'll say this is an IPv6 one, and we'll say, I don't know, 2001::1/ and actually I think that's all we need. Yeah. So then we put that in, right? So now I've got two TACACS servers defined, and I'm looking for that command right there, and there they are. And this is how you have to do it with the newer iOS versions. Again, if I come over here to router 9, you'll notice if I come here and I say, and maybe actually a better router is going to be router 1 maybe. So if I said AAA new model, right, you can see that the host keyword is here. But again, that's the legacy way of defining it. If I was to say TACACS, and you can see I've got both choices here. So what if I went with this, TACACS server, host, and I said 192, or actually let's make it easy, 1.1.1.1, right? And I hit enter. I'm hoping that this is going to cooperate because I should see a warning, outstanding, right? So here is the warning that you're going to see. If you use the syntax that we've been using in Packet Tracer, that's what you're going to see in the real world, is you're going to get a message telling you the CLI is going to be deprecated soon. and that that command is not going to work, and that this is the syntax you should be using. So again, keep that in mind as not only you work through these activities we work on, but if you're in a real networking environment, that is a legacy way to do it. And as of 15.6, and I don't know about 15.5, but as of 15.6, and I think I've got 15.5 here on this 1911, because I'm curious, because 15.5 right now, that's the recommended most stable release is the 15.5 train M code. So let's get into global config and let's say AAA new model, and then let's say TACACS and do a question mark. Oops, sorry, and do a question mark. You can see the TACACS server is there and host is not there. So that syntax might not even be accepted if you were trying to do if you upgraded from an older version of iOS to a newer version. Now, maybe it does the conversion for you. It's possible, but you can see it's not supported on 15.5 code, which is the most stable recommended release right now for the ISR G2s, right? 2900 series, what we're talking about. So remember, that syntax is legacy syntax, and the course does a good job calling that out, that is the legacy syntax, but that's what's supported here. So we've got the host defined, we've got the key defined, and I apologize, one go back here is after I put in the TACACS server for TAC1, after I put in the information for the address, I needed to put the key in, but I didn't put the key in because I don't have a TACACS server. So I would have needed to have put the key in. All right, so legacy syntax, so be aware of that. And where are we at here? We're right here. So configure AAA login authentication for console access on router 2. So AAA, new model, right? We know we need that right out of the gate. And now we're going to create a AAA. And is it default or do they want a fancy name for this? If not, okay, so enable AAA on router 2 and configure all logins to authenticate using the AAA TACACS server. If it is not available, use the local database. So here's where our method list now is going to grow. So at first we had a method list of 1, which was just local because we were looking at the local AAA database. Now our method list is going to have 2 methods with which we try to authenticate ourselves. So AAA authentication, excuse me, for login, and it doesn't ask us to name the method. So the method list. So we're going to go with default, and I'm going to see if that, yeah, it doesn't say, okay, default AAA, no, that's for the console login. All right, so we'll go with default here because I don't think they're going to want us to put something else. So remember, we're trying to authenticate with the group TACACS, the TACACS server first. If that doesn't work, we need to put local, right? And the reason we have to have local there is if this doesn't work, if we only had TACACS and I hit enter and the TACACS server for whatever reason was unreachable, or let's say they're doing maintenance on it, I'm not going to be able to get logged into the console port no matter what I do, right? So we want local there. So our method list, right, here is our list of methods. The first is group TACACS. If the TACACS servers aren't responding, then I fall back to my local AAA database to perform my authentication. Now, and this is the console line, I think, is it console line or SSH? Give me a second here. All logins to authenticate. On the console login, all right. So line con 0, and we have to say, oh, sorry. It's not login. Yeah, it is login, I'm sorry. Login authentication. And we just chose default as our name. And we did get points for that, so it should be default. This should also bring us a few additional points, and it did. So login default, and now we're going to verify user exec login using the AAA TACACS server. So how do we do that? Well, let's save our config. All right, let's exit out, and now let's try to get logged back in. So what was the username we created? It was admin2. Admin2, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm looking for the password. I can't remember. Oh, yeah, admin2PA55. Now, you'll notice there was a little hesitation there, right? Because at first it checks with the TACACS server, then And once that times out, then it comes to the local database, and then we get logged in, right? And we've got that user exact access, so we're good with part 3. We put a big check there. We're good. Now part 4 configures server-based AAA authentication using RADIUS on router 3. So again, very first thing we do before we say AAA new model, we're going to pull router 3 up, and we're going to create that very important, oops, sorry, we didn't want that. We're going to create that very important sort of fail-safe account that'll get us onto the device in the event that the RADIUS server is down, or that we type in AAA and it was Cisco ENPA 55. A lot of passwords to remember here. So we'll go from user exec to privilege exec with the enable command, and then we go from privilege exec with configure terminal into global config, where I'm going to say username, and we're going to have admin 3 as my guess. And I'm double checking here. What do they want? And the secret password of admin 3 PA 55. So we get a few points for that. So now that we've got that local user configured as our backup, we're going to say AAA, and remember, AAA new model, right? And now we're covered, and we're going to define the RADIUS server. So again, I say, and so very important, the syntax for the TACACS server in the host and the RADIUS server in the host, the same conversation applies. This is legacy command syntax. If I come over to a real Cisco router here, and what do we want to do? I guess we're going to do this on, was it 1 we got the message? Yeah. So over here, if I were to say RADIUS and do a question mark, you can see it's identical to the TACACS format from a syntax perspective. So when I say RADIUS server and I do a question mark, host is here, so let's put it in. So I'll say, whoops, host, and say it's 2.2.2.2. I should receive a message telling me, hey, this 15.3 code that you're running, you're using a legacy syntax to create this server definition. You should probably think twice about this. It says, please move to this syntax, RADIUS server, then the name, right? I'll just say rad1, right? And then we get into the sub configuration where I'm going to have to say, is it going to be IPv4 or IPv6, right? IPv4, and then we'll just say, 4.4.4.4. And then I can even define which ports, right? 1812, 1813. You can see that those are the default ports that are there, right? 16, 45, and 46 for auth and accounting. But if I hit that, then I can put the key in, ABC123 or whatever the key is on the RADIUS server itself. So remember that, because the newer versions of code, and this is definitely worth repeating, when you say RADIUS-server, there is no option for host, right? So be very, very careful with that syntax. All right, so we've got the RADIUS server, the legacy syntax here, 192.168.3.2, and then the RADIUS server definition, RADIUS server with the key definition of RADIUS, RADIUS PA55. All right. And so we've got that defined as well. Now, we already did the AAA new model command, so we're good there. And it's asking us to do what on router 3? Well, we're going to be doing basically the same thing that we just did, except this is going to be for, okay, it's the console login again, so we're good to go. So we know how to do this, right? So AAA, authentication, and it's, remember, for logging in, we're going to use the default and the group, right? The first method in our method list is RADIUS. The second method in our method list is the local AAA database. So we're going to use the remote server AAA database on the RADIUS server first in the method list, then the local AAA database is our second option in our method list. All right, and so we've got that done, and again, the console port, so we're going to say line con 0, and remember, this is where we say login authentication, and if I'd given it a special name like console or con1 or con AAA, I would type that in here, but we settled on the default, so we're going to go ahead and put the default in there. Now, my guess is, and actually it gave us the 5 points, but let's validate. Let's make sure that this works. And how are we going to be doing this? It's one of the PCs, or they don't ask us actually to check that. Okay. So we're not asked to check it, but if we did, right, we would do it from PCC, and let's make sure that it functions, and who knows, packet tracer, maybe this works, maybe this doesn't. SSH-L admin 3, and my guess is, hold on one second here, let me say IP config, and so yeah, it is 3.1. So SSH-L admin 3 and 192.168.3.1. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. It was the console connect. My bad. It was the console connectivity. We didn't put it on the VTY lines, right? I put it on the console. But what if we did? Let's check it out. Line VTY 0 through 15. Let's make sure this works, right? So login, or I'm sorry. Yeah. Login, authentication. I always get these commands confused, the commands mixed up. Login, authentication, default. So now, if I come over here to PCC, and again, I can use that default for multiple things, and transport input is what? So let's make sure we say transport input SSH and see if that lets us connect. No. So for whatever reason, it's not allowing us to connect, but we've got the transport input SSH. We've got the login on the VTY lines. It might be packet tracer not allowing us in. But anyway, we've got it configured, right? So quick review. What did we do? We set up on all 3 routers a fail-safe account right out of the gate. And you want to do that right out of the gate. You want to make sure that the privilege level, if it's not the default of 1, is 0. You want to make sure that no matter what happens, they're forced to type in the enable password. Then what we did next was we leveraged the local AAA database using the new AAA model, where we created an authentication, or I should say a method list that we named default, right? Or you could give it a custom name, and we saw that. And we use the local AAA database. And the reason, and you're probably wondering, well, wait a second, this is kind of meaningless because all we did was use the local database for the first set that we did. Well, yes, but you can also do authorization, right? Remember, there's 3 A's that are in there: authentication, authorization, and accounting. And so this is the beginning of a bigger conversation as to how to leverage authorization and accounting to be able to control which commands users are allowed to enter in, right? And believe me, there are thousands of options when you get into the nitty-gritty of TACACS and RADIUS and controlling what the users are able to do. But this is the beginning of that conversation. So we started out with the local AAA database. We saw how to create the method list. Then we transitioned to the TACACS server, and we created a method list with 2 methods. First the TACACS server, then the local AAA database. So the remote AAA database, then the local AAA database. Then we did it with RADIUS. And again, we applied it to the console lines. You could apply it to the VTY lines. You could apply it to the auxiliary line if you wanted to. But the bottom line is that when you start to scale your network out in terms of number of devices, having a centralized authentication repository, and you know what? You could even point this to an LDAP server for that matter. And you could have the RADIUS and the TACACS servers referencing Active Directory if you wanted to do that, right? So that you don't have to enter in all those accounts individually. So there are a lot of ways to do this, and all of them are better than simply creating local user accounts on all of your devices. All right, well, we've got the 100 out of 100. This is going to wrap up Packet Tracer Activity 3.6.1.2, where we did a nice look at AAA authentication. And remember, the syntax that we're using here is the legacy syntax. So don't be shocked if you get onto a device that's 15.5 or later and the commands that we're running are not there. Packet Tracer is going to catch up at some point, but I'll guarantee you that the majority of the implementations that you may be working with, especially if you're in the government space like I am, you're probably going to see the legacy implementation with the legacy syntax, and you're probably going to be running an iOS version that was around during the Flintstone era. So again, try to stay on top of that. and keep things up to date, because there's some great advantages that you've got when you keep things up to date. All right, that wraps up 3612. Thanks for watching, and I will talk with you soon.